You clicked exactly right. It's Berlin briefing time. The German Chancellor got turned into a showroom for drones this week. Instead of asking for drones, Ukraine's President Volodimir Zelenskyy got the stage by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz to show off what Ukraine can bring to the new strategic partnership that both countries declared this week. Is this just whistling in the dark with wars going on in Ukraine, of course, and the Middle East, which are drawing resources from each other? Or is a new normal with wartime Ukraine possible, even profitable business? I have experts with me who can get us a clear view on reality beyond those competing narratives. Down the line, I can speak to Gerlinde Niehus. She's the former Deputy Director for Defense and Security Cooperation at NATO and now an independent expert. In Kyiv is our Ukraine correspondent Nick Connolly, and here with me in the studio is Berlin Briefing co-host and defense expert Nina Haase, who just comes back from the latest Ukraine contact group, which also took place in Berlin this week with more significant weapons commitments for Kyiv. But first, I want to check in with you, Gerlinde Niehus. You used to be in charge of NATO partnerships. Does it impress you at all when Germany and Ukraine in this current situation declare a new strategic partnership, or does this look like more window dressing?
No, I think there's some substance in that. I mean, I went through this joint declaration, which has a whole range of really also concrete steps and measures. The funding is, I think, significant. So I think there's real substance there. So I wouldn't call it entirely window dressing. But I think the broader point is that Germany and hopefully other Europeans need really to realize that Ukraine is not solely a petitioner, but that on the European side, we have enormous areas where we can learn from Ukraine. And the way they have been applying what I would call a total defense approach against Russia is one of them. Innovation is another key area where we can learn a lot. Leadership is an area where we could learn a lot. So I think we are all well advised as Europeans to consider Ukraine as an integral part in our future European security architecture. That's the way we need to build it.
And we also saw a very self-confident Ukrainian president here in Berlin. Let's take a listen of what he said about the newly found capacities of his own defense industry 4 years into the war.
Most of the weapons deployed were manufactured in Ukraine, and the various drone deals we've concluded are also based on the fact that thanks to our production capacity, we can manufacture twice as much as we need ourselves.
So, Nina, at the same time, we saw the British Defence Minister announce that he's going to send 120,000 more drones to Ukraine. How does all of that fit together? You were at this latest Ukraine meeting.
Well, you know, the Ukraine Defense Contact Group is, of course, the group that used to be called Ramstein Group, where Ukraine's partners get together regularly to take stock of what Ukraine needs and to coordinate who has what to offer, what are Ukraine's immediate priorities, who can bring them to the table so that things don't double up, essentially. This was something that is not under the NATO umbrella. This is done essentially as a conglomerate of willing countries that want to help Ukraine, which is now, of course, in its 5th year of defending itself against Russian aggression and has been able to sustain itself because, of course, of aid from its partner countries. Now, the contact group last year was then the chairmanship was handed back by the United States to the coalition, because the Americans used to run it, but then Donald Trump is very proud of not supporting Ukraine actively, which is why then Germany and Britain took over. And so this is a meeting where yesterday or on Wednesday here in Berlin, new announcements were made, but also it's always an opportunity to take stock. And I found it very interesting that the Ukrainian defense minister yesterday, Mr. Fedorov, stood there on stage and said, okay, look what you promised last time in, under this Ramstein format. 2 months ago, you said you were going to send 38 billion euros in aid. Some of that money is arriving, but we all have to do our homework. And at the same time as well, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte was there in Berlin. So this is, of course, always also an opportunity to show symbolically that Ukraine has partners that are standing by its sides. You know, you've got the British Defence Minister, you've got the German, the Ukrainian, and then NATO Secretary General. Everybody's sort of saying, hey, with everything that's going on in the Middle East, let's not lose sight of what's happening in Ukraine. So Mark Rutte then, of course, also trying to say, hey, yes, I travel to Washington and I remind them that this is also important. And I'm still optimistic that they also see it that way, that supporting Ukraine is important.
Yes, of course. And we saw Mark Rutte actually when he went to DC just a couple of days ago, then in an interview saying, responding yes to the question whether that attack launched on Iran by the US and Israel made the world a safer place. That's very controversially discussed this side of the Atlantic. And this is seen as an appeasement policy as well. But let's just take a listen to his optimism. And he is in the business of spreading optimism over the concern that the US may stop the flow of weapons to Ukraine.
The good news is that the flow continues and that there is a broad understanding on both sides of the ocean that we do have to do end-to-end. That is make sure that we refill all our stockpiles, because this is not only a US problem, also a European problem. We have to ramp up the defense industrial production. But at the same time, we have to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to stay in the fight. So there is a broad agreement on that on both sides of the Atlantic.
Nina, how sure is that Ukraine has what it needs?
There is a very big fear that, of course, some of the stockpiles may not reach Ukraine, that instead the United States is going to sell weapons or is going to use weapons in the Middle East, is going to use and refocus its efforts to the Middle East. So that is something that is a very, very, very specific concern, because, of course, you can't ramp up production indefinitely either. And Patriot missiles, for example, is something, one such case where already it's stretched and, you know, basically reached its limit capacity for production of new missiles, so or of new systems. So this is something where the Americans, they have effectively stopped funding Ukraine themselves. They have agreed to allow the Europeans to buy weapons from the United States to then give to Ukraine. This is something that the US administration is really proud of, that they're no longer paying, instead the Europeans are buying and giving it to Ukraine. In fact, J.D. Vance is described as having bragged about this being one of the biggest achievements. This also happened this week, right, where J.D. Vance, the vice president, says, hey, one of the biggest achievements that I'm proudest of by this administration is to have stopped funding Ukraine. And you can never be sure. Donald Trump is an erratic man. He's basically commander-in-chief. Is he going to really commit to what he says he's doing? If he's selling weapons to the Europeans, when will they get them? Will he prioritize them? There is a mechanism that is called PEARL, Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List. Is he going to adhere to it or not? You know, of course, on the stage, this is the big elephant in the room. They're always trying to spread optimism, and the Ukrainians know it. There's no chance for them to be angry about not really knowing whether they can believe it or not. They just have to live with that fear.
Yeah, and Pearl, essentially it's a big shopping list that the Europeans pay for. Friedrich Merz also stressed that Germany now has been, for more than a year, the largest supporter of Ukraine. And what we saw this week was very different, though. We saw Zelenskyy not just come and ask for something. We just listened to him be very self-confident about what Ukraine has to offer. There's an attempt to create a new normal in a wartime scenario. Nick, I just want to take this over to you, and I appreciate you've had a very rough night. There's been severe strikes in Kyiv, but also Dnipro. Several people have been killed. So just fill us in what the discussion is, what the sense actually is in Ukraine right now on this.
Well, I mean, just going from last night here in Kyiv, you could definitely hear the air defense working. So it seems like some of those resources are still present, even though we'd had Zelenskyy recently in an interview saying the situation couldn't get any worse in terms of Patriot interceptor availability. I think, in terms of Zelenskyy and his appearance on the stage there with Merz in Berlin, he is cheerleader in chief. That is his job, right? To promote Ukrainian defense innovation, to try and change that perception of Ukraine, as you mentioned, from a kind of country asking for help to a country that can provide solutions. And weirdly, I think the kind of events in Iran have actually helped Ukraine. We've had those images of Zelenskyy doing the rounds in the Middle East, talking to people, offering Ukrainian drone teams, offering advice. I think that's done more to change the perception, the images, rather than necessarily what they've achieved on the ground, than all the kind of arguments that Ukraine has been leveling in kind of more bilateral formats. There was an exercise between NATO troops in Estonia facing off against some Ukrainian drone teams last year, and the reporting on that suggests that basically, a very small number of experienced Ukrainian drone teams were able to basically rout NATO forces in a very short number of hours, and it seemed like those NATO troops, several years into this war, still hadn't really learned any lessons from the war here on the ground in Ukraine. So there's a sense that, yes, Ukraine has all this experience, has these technologies, but are European countries really listening and willing to change their defense approaches? Are they really going to go beyond saying, oh, look how resilient you are, look how innovative you are, great, well done, pat on the back? Are they really willing to change the way they spend money on defense? Or are they still going to buy small numbers of very, very expensive systems that then they probably won't have enough munitions for, or that are very limited in terms of the kind of production capacity? So I think that there's lots of questions there, lots of skepticism from Ukraine. Obviously, right now, Ukraine is going to engage and try and earn as much money as possible. There's talk of tens of billions of euros of capacity that is unused internally for Ukraine's defense because the government doesn't have the money. So if that was then used to produce weapons for Europe, that could be earning money for the Ukrainian defense industry to subsidize what it produces for its own army and also generate tax. I think it is always a kind of situation of having your kind of back to the war here in Ukraine, right? There's never been a situation where Ukraine has been able to rely long term on stable production of the weapons it needs and stable deliveries. It's always a question of being promised X and getting half that amount a couple of months later and having to try and improvise. In terms of the interceptor missile, I think that really is one of the biggest questions now, because Ukraine has been pretty good at intercepting ballistic missiles. There's hope that Germany now will be producing in the next couple of years interceptor missiles, albeit the older type, the PAC-2, not the PAC-3. But it seems like the Americans are in no hurry to share the technology. So this would still basically be sending, largely US parts to Germany to then be assembled in Germany. And that really limits how far Germany can ramp up production and, start doing things without that kind of bottleneck of American spare parts and basically America having the ability to say yes or no to more production. So right now, it's really a question of more of the kind of production capacities rather than money. I think money is not the issue right now. Ukraine can find the money to get more of these missiles, but it's a question of, will it be prioritized in America's production? Will America say we're sending those interceptors to the Middle East or to Israel or to Asia? And will it finally allow Europe to do a bit more to actually start producing more of this on its own?
Yes, and that's a very volatile factor and unpredictable factor. I want to take that to you, Gerlinde. It's great to be able to talk to someone who was on the inside of NATO scenario planning and now can talk freely. So which scenarios does NATO have to brace itself for? And is Ukraine potentially the alternative to the US? Nobody's saying it openly right now, but planning is already beginning to start without a United States and NATO. It's actually a bit difficult to get that sentence over my lips, but what can you fill us in on the background thinking that's taking place right now in NATO?
Well, perhaps a few things here. First, if I may, to put this question of support to Ukraine into a broader context, I think what we have seen is that, yes, the Ukraine is still in the fight because of the support which has been provided to it over the years of this war. But this support has constantly arrived too little, too late, and with too many caveats. And the main reason for that is that we, on our side, our politicians, our so-called political leaders, were afraid of any potential escalation vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin. So we were very good in deterring ourselves. We were not very good in deterring Putin. Yeah. So I think we have to really change mindset there and define a policy which is a Russia containment policy, which would which would acknowledge risk, but which also would then lead to a much more robust support of Ukraine. Also in light of all the added values Ukraine can bring to the table. On the Pearl mechanism, because that was mentioned as well, yes, it is working. Actually, I've been instrumental in setting it up some time ago. But there's also now reports that the Pentagon, or the Ministry of War, as it used to call itself these days, intends to divert some 50 million of European funds, which have been transferred for buying these American weapons, transferring these 50 million to be used in the war on Iran. So if that were to happen, it's not yet confirmed, but if that were to happen, it would be something one would call theft under normal circumstances. Yeah? So, and now clearly we have to deal with a president, the US President Trump, who is supporting the aggressor, i.e. Putin, and coercing the victim, and clearly muddles this up. Huh? I think Friedrich Merz is finally realizing what he has to deal with when it comes to Trump. So the need for much more European leadership on our side. And indeed, I mean, this is now reflected, and in a way that's the good news, in the recent activities, let's say, within NATO, but not formally in NATO, because it's starting as a coalition of the willing, where they are now discussing, thankfully, the so-called, let's say, Europeanization of NATO. So what would it take to replace American capabilities throughout the alliance? And clearly that's more than just looking at a European SACEUR, so the Supreme Commander. And that would mean to replace the roughly 44% of American capabilities, which are still foreseen in the entire NATO defense planning process, which is already a reduced amount, and it's intended to be reduced even further to something like 30% in 2032. But that's simply too late. We don't have that time. So I would assume that the discussions which are taking place in a coalition of the willing format are now all about looking into how can we replace American capabilities throughout the entire NATO planning process. And that would then be typically, I mean, capacities such as intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, command and control, air defense, long-range weapons, to name just a few.
But this is not going to happen in the next couple of years. We're at a pretty critical moment here. Can you just kind of outline for us how critical this moment is, the coming months?
Well, I mean, we have always been in a critical moment. The thing is, I mean, we have to change mindset, yeah? And we need to get away from our mindset of we are living in peace and we have all the time on this planet to eventually get our act together. No, we are not living in peace. We are living in a situation of shadow war, which Russia is waging against us and intensifying regularly. Yeah, so we need a much higher sense of urgency. We need, if you wish, also our industry to move to what I would call war economy, war production. And we also need the political leadership who tells the truth to the people on where we are. So I think that's the attitude we need. We would have needed years ago, and we need it more than ever, because I mean we have 5 million people in Europe. We have rich countries among us, some with more economic problems than others, but we do have the resources. We just need to get going.
Lina, I want to take this to you because, we'll let you just respond.
Yeah, because I really would like to hear from you, Gerlinde. The other elephant in the room, I mean, one is the reduced commitment by the US to Ukraine. The other big elephant in the room is that the the burden sharing is not working, even in the coalition of the willing. People, all those countries that are saying that they're standing by Ukraine's side, but then they are not delivering. They're delivering too late, too little, as you just said. And of course, it's very hard, and I understand for a politician or a diplomat that they can't say, hey, France, Spain, why aren't you doing your homework? But from your experience, because you were involved, which are those countries, and who would you say needs to be called out here as well for essentially just doing a lot of announcements and making a lot of announcements and then not delivering?
Yeah, well, everyone is delivering somewhat. Yeah, the thing is that, of course, the size and the magnitude of the delivery varies substantially between countries such as Germany or the Baltics, Norway, etc., and then those countries which are, let's say, on the southern rim. Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece, some of which also have traditionally closer ties with Russia. I mean, talking about Greece, or China for that matter. But I think the key thing here is to also explain in those countries that the threat from Russia is by no means a threat from the East only. Yeah, it is likely, or at the same time, a threat from the South, because Russia is destabilizing African countries big scale through Wagner or its successor organizations, thereby fueling immigration, which is something those countries are concerned about. So if they want to have more stability at home, they also need to look south, and then they also meet Russia there. So I think they need to also use that as an argument vis-a-vis their own populations, that no, by no means. I mean, the threat is not just vis-a-vis Poland and the Baltics. It's also on our doorsteps coming from the south, or in fact, also coming through a number of political parties. I mean, in Spain, the right-wing party, extreme right party Vox, has good connections with Putin's Russia. So it's you also have your Trojan horses in these countries.
But I want to take one question to you, Nina, because you also cover the Social Democrat Party of Vice Chancellor Lars Klingbeil, which comes from a
former Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who was one of these people that Gerlinde just mentioned, were hesitant of escalating or of provoking Vladimir Putin too much. Yes,
his perception was that actually getting more engaged would be provocation. So he did buy into what was really a Russian threat. I just want to remind ourselves that it was a Social Democrat Chancellor more than 20 years ago in 2004 who launched or who last held these strategic partnership talks with Ukraine. So he was taking that region a lot more seriously, even in peacetime. He's now disgraced because he is a personal friend, Gerhard Schröder, of Vladimir Putin. But we have here in Germany a Social Democrat defense minister, and he is the most popular politician here in Germany. The German chancellor is the least popular.
And one of the staunchest Ukraine supporters. That
absolutely, but he's like a unicorn within his own party. Friedrich Merz needs this coalition partner, which is very skeptical on the whole. And when Gerlinde says politicians need to tell the truth, I mean, there's already a lot of hard truths that German voters, that the German public have to digest. Why the caution also on the Social Democrat side? How afraid are German politicians of actually facing up to what are very ugly realities for a very wealthy country that is feeling the shock, the energy price shock at the moment of the Iran war?
You know, Michaela, to be honest, I get the feeling that the Social Democrats are in the deepest identity crisis they've ever been in. And this is...
We've heard this very often before, but it gets ever deeper, yes.
Yeah, but I mean, we're talking about the last couple of months or years. But since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Social Democrats have been on a downward slope in this identity crisis, because it really depends who you talk to. You'll find the most... the strongest Ukraine supporters, in people like Boris Pistorius. But then also
German Defense Minister. Yeah.
German Defense Minister. You also find people who come from a tradition of, sort of left-wing, let's make peace with Russia, let's abandon all weapons. Mikhail Gorbachev is one of their biggest idols, the man who, of course, was the leader of what is now Russia. in that period of the collapse of the Soviet Empire. So, they have this ideal that, hey, we came so close to having Russia as a good and friendly neighbor. Can't we go back to that? And what Gerlinde is saying is change the mindset of people. This is, you have to look into Russia's history, that Mikhail Gorbachev was the exception to the rule. Russia is such a big country, and it has, over the last couple of centuries, taken an imperialist stance on things. And Mikhail Gorbachev was quite an exception historically. So this is something that people in the SPD, in the Social Democrats, are not willing to accept. And that is something where it's very difficult for politicians to explain that Russia needs to be contained, as Gerlinde says, and that you can't forge ever closer ties with Russia because there is a risk that you might fall into its sphere of influence under conditions that are not favourable to you, as Estonians will tell you gladly.
And we have seen an admission, both, particularly also by the German Defence Minister, that there is a hybrid war that's already ongoing. The German Chancellor said we're not at war, but we're not at peace either. So nobody really wants to get into that territory.
They are attributing attacks to Russia openly now. But it's only started over the last 2 years or so that they're saying we're seeing hybrid attacks, we're seeing acts of sabotage that we can attribute to Russia, to the Kremlin. This is something where, you talk of hybrid war and everybody goes, yeah, okay, we don't know, is that a private thing or, maybe it's an accident. And they're trying to tie the knots. And this is one of the things that Germany's top soldier, Carsten Breuer, always uses, this expression, let's try and connect the dots. Let's try and see the full picture. It's the narratives that are being spun also by, willing helpers that they find in Europe's populist, mostly right-wing, but some also left-wing parties, where they spread Russian narratives or Kremlin narratives. It's the acts of sabotage. And all of these things are intensifying to a point where politicians have to tread a very careful line, making people aware. And our politicians here in Germany are afraid of essentially scaring people away. And all the polls that you see are basically saying people are willing to take these bad news. They are ready. Don't underestimate your citizens.
Nick, I think I want to take this to you, to Kyiv, because we've now successfully recreated the conditions that you work under. You faced a heavy bombardment overnight, and there's a lot of talking and analysing about Ukraine, very often with Ukraine not that closely at the table and being at the receiving end. How is all of this, the inaction that we've just really highlighted here, being perceived where you are?
Look, I think Ukraine's expectations of Europe and of Germany more specifically are pretty low, right? Everyone remembers here the beginning of the war, the then defense minister offering helmets rather than any tanks or anything more useful than that. So I think the current German government, Chancellor Merz in particular, that is already a big step forward from a Ukrainian perspective. Everyone here remembers his talk about sending more kind of aggressive military capacity to Ukraine in terms of missiles, Taurus missiles. That hasn't happened, but even the fact that he was willing to talk about it and seemed committed to it on a personal level is something that really people notice. It's a vibes thing as much as it is about the actual specifics, right? Him versus Olaf Scholz and his hesitance and his kind of unwillingness to say anything that might sound too aggressive towards Moscow. So I think that's already a big step forward. People do see the numbers, right? That Germany is very clearly the biggest donor. They also are starting to notice the difference, particularly with France, right? Zelenskyy has had a very close relationship with Emmanuel Macron since the beginning of the war. He's talked about how they chat on WhatsApp. They have that kind of direct contact and that obvious chemistry. But actually, if you look at the numbers, France is very significantly behind and is often actually outspent by smaller countries like the Netherlands or Denmark, who are investing a whole lot more in Ukraine's defense than France is. The UK obviously has tried to be there, also has its 100-year partnership agreement with Ukraine, but is also going through a pretty difficult fiscal period right now and doesn't necessarily have the resources to send quite as much money as Germany is. So I think that is all being seen kind of positively. So I think that there is a kind of perception here that Europe does have staying power, is committed to Ukraine in the longer term, but just is very caught up in itself, its own bureaucratic processes. And that's also part of the problem when it comes to, say, drones coming from Europe, that, okay, great, you're giving us something, but then if we tell you something doesn't work because we've noticed it on the battlefield, you'll take another 6 months, 9 months to actually then fix it, because all this equipment then has to be sent back to the factory and can't be improvised on the on the fly as Ukrainian equipment would be by battlefield units that actually then just open up the drones and change something with a bit of equipment they've got off AliExpress or another Chinese platform. So I think Ukrainians have kind of factored that in, and I think they're just hoping now that the opening of the export markets, Ukraine didn't allow its defense producers to sell internationally up till recently, that will actually just now bring in the money to kind of help Ukraine develop more and actually then cross-subsidize the weapons it's building for itself.
And this, of course, with Volodymyr Zelenskyy saying that Ukraine has allegedly the capacity to build twice as many drones as they need for themselves. But what he wants most of all are guarantees. The whole question of how guaranteed US security guarantees are, that's a question that's up in the open, and he's all the more insistent about wanting to join the European Union fast track. That's what he was promised at the very beginning of all of this, and also join NATO. That, of course, is legally not possible at the moment. But let's just take a listen what he responded to a reporter who asked whether Friedrich Merz, the Europeans, would be offering some kind of EU membership light. Here was the somewhat impatient response by Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
The European Union, or NATO, needs Ukraine as a full partner. Our army is a strong one, because nobody needs a light version of the Ukrainian army.
And Friedrich Merz is going nowhere near promising a timeline. In fact, I sense a kind of behind closed doors relief that the newly elected Hungarian leader who replaces Viktor Orban, who so blocked Ukraine across the board, also is not open to fast-track EU membership. But here's as far as Friedrich Merz was willing to go.
The people of Ukraine should know that their future lies in Europe, if they so choose. And to that end, we want to pave the way now, knowing that there are still many tasks to be accomplished on both sides.
So, Gerlinde, I want to conclude your final round of your take on all of this. How critical is time at this moment?
Well, in many ways, we lost a lot of time with Ukraine. In fact, already since 2008, at the Bucharest summit, where, of course, I was as well. I do remember a very telling scene, Vladimir Putin coming out of the session of the NATO-Russia Council, completely red-faced, after heated discussions about the NATO intention at the time to offer the membership action plan to Ukraine and Georgia. And what happened, if you may remember, was that Angela Merkel and then Sarkozy succumbed to pressure from Vladimir Putin. So just to say, had we not had had we had the courage to invite Ukraine back then in 2008, we probably wouldn't be where we are with all the losses and all the devastation Russia has been inflicting on Ukraine since 4 years. So that is the sad reality or the sad truth. Yeah.
And the United States was willing to go down that road. That was President Bush.
The United States, led by Condoleezza Rice at the time, and Bush as the president, yes, they were advocating for that. But since it required a NATO consensus, it didn't materialize largely because of opposition from Germany and France. There were some others hiding behind them, but the ones who really succumbed to Putin were Angela Merkel and Sarkozy. Now, in going forward, yes, on the NATO front, clearly the membership is stalled ever since then, even if in the summit declaration it says something like Ukraine's irreversible path to NATO membership. But of course, with a president like Trump, this is it's just paper. Yeah. So all the more important to expedite the EU integration of Ukraine, and in that context also look into how Europeans could operationalize this by now famous Article 42.7 about mutual assistance. Because in many ways, I think that should be looked at from a holistic perspective, meaning including Ukraine. And the same would apply, in my mind, to going forward in setting up. I would call it a coalition of the willing, which could be a basis for a new European security architecture, which eventually draws upon large parts of the NATO structure. Yeah? But if it's constructed around a coalition of the willing, also that can integrate Ukraine into the planning. Yeah. So this is to say, I mean, if we want to make Europe whole and free, we have to integrate Ukraine into those plans. Because and Zelenskyy is absolutely right. I mean, there is no army, armed forces who has a comparable experience in fighting and in innovating and in pushing back the Russians. Yeah. So it's in our own interest to do this.
I just want one more number from you. How many years is the current NATO structure away from being able to replace the US contribution?
Well, it's difficult as a guesstimate, but I think we need to do this within the next 2 years, largely. Yeah, because what I'm seeing is that regardless of Trump, which I don't consider to be a kind of accident. Yeah. So even if there is another president, the trajectory of the US is they're drifting away. The tectonic plates between the US and Europe are moving apart. So we have to live with that reality. We are on our own. Yeah. And the sooner we realize it, the better for all of us. Yeah. And yeah, we don't have much time. Ironically, and that's a bitter irony, Ukraine and Russia's war against Ukraine buys us time. Yeah? Because as long as Russia is fighting against Ukraine and Ukraine defending itself, they do not have the capacity to open another similar front elsewhere. Yeah? But it's with Ukraine's blood and treasure that we are buying time here.
Gerlinde, thank you so much. I'm going to take that as the concluding assessment, as of course Ukraine is hopeful that now the European Union will soon release those 90 billion that were blocked by Viktor Orban, who just suffered this crushing defeat in his elections. But of course, there are a lot more factors playing into the stability of the supplies of weapons, of money, of political support for Ukraine. So this for sure is not the last Berlin briefing we will have done on this. I want to thank Gerlinde, of course. Thanks so much for joining us, giving us your expertise. Nick Connolly in Kyiv for your first-hand accounts as always. And Nina Haase here in the studio, our double expert on all things defense and the Social Democrat coalition partner of Friedrich Merz. With that, you're fully briefed up. Do drop us a line if there's any specific aspect you want us to dedicate more attention to, and check out our Berlin briefing newsletter, which fills you in with a lot more in-depth reporting and analysis. If you haven't signed up yet, please do. For now, thanks for joining us, and I look forward to next time.